No, fair enough. The only reason I mentioned the comment in regards to you being left leaning was because a lot of people would argue that your political views perhaps may influence your interpretation of history. What would your response to be that, if anything?
Yeah, there was a famous quote by Norman Finkelstein, you know, the Jewish scholar, and on Israel and Palestine and so on. And he gets, you know, he's a Jewish scholar himself, and his family was, you know, killed and tortured and during the Nazi regime. And you know, he's very, I wouldn't say pro-Palestine, but he's really critical of Israel as a Jewish, and he has a really strong voice for those things like that. And he's written some really good books on that, and I highly recommend his work. And he you know, he gets cast. He said, how, as a Jewish person, you know, like, how can you not be pro-Israel? Like, why do you, you know, stand for so much things on Palestine and so on? And he says, you know, I'm not pro-Israel. I'm not even pro-Palestine. I'm just pro-justice, you know? And that quote, which I think he said in an interview with Mehdi Hassan, really struck a chord, because it's like, you know, left and right and all these things, whatever you want to describe it, what are you really, you know, criticizing here? So if people are saying I'm leftist and all these things, I'm making those criticisms, yeah, go ahead. I mean, I welcome criticism. It's nothing like that, but it's like, I wouldn't say I'm left or right. I would just say I'm pro-justice. And you got to think to yourself, well, what does that look like, right? What does that world look like where you want to be pro-justice, whether it's economic justice, whether it's social justice, whether it's political justice, whether it's kind of racial justice, whether it's wealth justice? What do these kind of things look like, you know? Even if you know, take the context of Sikhi and say, for example, the Anandpur Sahib resolution, a lot of people don't know that it's a, you know, it's a proclamation, and it's got resolutions that include things like reparations. So let's say, for example, now, if I make the argument for reparations and someone says, oh, you know, look at this lefty talking about reparations. Reparations is a form of financial justice, right? It's what you've been owed, well, in the context of Anandpur Sahib resolution, they were talking about reparations for people that are refugees that have suffered partition, right? As a result of like the elite politics of India. And that's a form of economic justice. And this is what economic justice looks like. That's how it's manifested, through the form of reparations. But if I talk about reparations and someone's saying, oh, look at this leftist, or say, for example, even things like healthcare or other left-leaning policies, or what you would describe as left today, what they really just actually are is just pro-justice policies. Even labor rights, you know, labor rights in terms of people's labor justice, in terms of being fairly paid and not exploited, which we know is, you know, a lot of the bedrock principles of Sikhi, and there's so many Sakhis of Guru Nanak that, you know, that kind of illustrate that. If Guru Nanak squeezed two rotiyan, or if someone, you know, did a protest today at Downing Street and squeezed two rotiyan, you know, and it was staged, and there was blood coming out of another one and milk coming out of another one, and we were talking about exploitation of labor and child labor and all these things, those same people would still have the criticism and say, oh, look at this lefty, right? And it's like, that's what labor justice looks like. So what do you think economic justice looks like? What do you think social justice looks like? What do you think religious justice looks like? And I think if you use that kind of...
Just a quick one on your point, because I think it's a brilliant example that you've used. Would you say that the fundamental difference between the framework of Guru Nanak Dev Ji and this left-right framework is that actually Guru Nanak Dev Ji's framework is completely self-sovereign in that it's perpetuated by the community. There is no state involvement, quote unquote. However, the left and right system is actually a political system that always is going to involve some form of nation state.
It's also quite new as well. I mean, the right is defined as this, you know, neoliberal free marketplace agent.
Again, tying into Christianity, colonialism,
yeah, and so on, and these things. And one interest, and the left is obviously again, I would just say what people would like to call the left, no matter what it is. I just think it looks like pro-justice. So if you have an issue with maybe things that are pro-justice, maybe you have an issue with the methodology of things. Maybe you don't agree with the forms of justice it takes or the strategies and so on. But if you generally take a pro-justice view, And then we would kind of conform to what pro-justice looks like. I think a lot of people that maybe criticize me for being maybe too left, either, and I don't mean this insultingly, either have a limited understanding on some things about how it, or not actually don't have skin in the game of how it affects them. You know, like for example, I live on rent, and I stay heavily. I look closely and stay focused on issues concerning rent and renters' rights and landlords and things like that. Whereas a lot of people don't, who can criticize me for taking up issues about landlords and how, you know, the accumulation of private property and houses is causing this huge housing crisis. You know, what are my views on social housing? You know, that used to be the pride of Britain until the 70s, that had been completely liquidated by Margaret Thatcher and this new neoliberal era. But that's a different discussion. But what I'm trying to say is that there are things that certain policies inflict injustice, right? And I think as a Sikh, or at least my opinion of what it means to be a Sikh, is to just see where there is injustice, because that's always going to be either a consequence or an unintended consequence of something. Anyone makes any decision on any grounds, on anything, someone's going to lose out. And it's about kind of minimizing that or mitigating that, is kind of redressing that and saying, look, there was an injustice. India, Pakistan was created and there was a huge injustice. You know, we don't want to go back to a Bharat state, but give reparations to the refugees, give them adequate housing, give them adequate access to, you know, clean water, don't make them live in kind of these camps or refugee camps, or kind of limit or reduce the military controls on their confinements and all these things like that. Give them education, give them kind of, you know, reservations to kind of give them access to social mobility, all these kind of things like that. I think they all look like pro-justice positions to me. And maybe we would be called leftists, or maybe would be criticized for that. But I think, again, getting inspiration from Norman Finkelstein, I'll just say I'm pro-justice. And if you have a criticism about what that looks like, then it's probably most likely comes down to maybe the strategy, or they don't, or they have a limited understanding. And I'm sorry to say that, I don't mean that in an insulting way, or they don't have skin in the game in terms of if they've ever experienced poverty or homelessness, or what it means like to be hungry. You know, take for example the policy that was disputed today, more recently with Marcus Rashford, right? About feeding school children during the break because of the coronavirus. And, you know, I'm having full-blown conversations with Sikhs and other people that, you know, criticizing me, saying, look, you know what, don't just give them handouts. It's not fair like that.
Well, I was just going to actually say, before you brought up the Marcus Rashford thing, which actually ties in nicely, wouldn't you argue that Langar is a leftist idea? It's universal right of food.
I think in a grand sense, in a very grand sense, you could say yes, but I think we have to remember that Sikhi became. Here's another thing as well. It's a really important talking point, I think, that I would like to your listeners to know or hear, is that Sikhi came before the Industrial Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution was like probably the most pivotal and momentous like moments in history that radically transformed our society. So a lot of these things that we currently associate or consider to be left or right is, you know, post-industrial revolution in that sense.
Well, just to add a little bit of historical context, left and right comes from the French Revolution, where they sat on either the left bench or the right-hand side, and everything actually derives from that.